From Bandung to now, non-alignment, civilization, and the strategic construction of post-colonial power. Introduction: Non-alignment as strategy rather than moral posture. The doctrine of non-alignment didn't emerge as an idealistic moral philosophy, but as a strategic response to a structural asymmetry within the Cold War international system. The dominant narrative portrays non-alignment as a principled refusal of newly independent states to submit to either American or Soviet hegemony, often linking to Gandhian ethics or anti-colonial solidarity. However, this interpretation obscures the instrumental logic embedded within the policy. The formation of the Non-Aligned Movement (NAM) represents not the triumph of ethical foreign policy but the recalibration of geopolitical leverage by states lacking material parity with superpowers. The empirical question is not why non-alignment exists, but why India institutionalized it through the creation of an international coalition after already successfully maintaining an independent foreign policy trajectory. The decision reflects a calculated effort to reshape the normative architecture of international relations in ways that enhanced bargaining autonomy while simultaneously preserving strategic flexibility. The rhetoric of universal peace masked a functional objective, preventing structural absorption into bipolar conflict systems that would reduce policy degrees of freedom. The intellectual prehistory of non-alignment and civilization as ideological infrastructure. Prior to the emergence of non-alignment as a formal policy framework, post-colonial elites mobilized the concept of civilization as a mechanism for reversing. Prior to the emergence of non-alignment as a formal policy framework, post-colonial elites mobilized the concept of civilization as a mechanism for reversing colonial hierarchies of legitimacy. European imperial ideology had historically relied upon civilizational gradation to justify domination, posing positioning colonized populations as politically immature and therefore incapable of sovereign governance. The reappropriation of civilization discourse by Asian political actors functioned as a counter-hegemonic semiotic inversion. Rather than rejecting civilizational classification, post-colonial leaders repurposed it to claim epistemic superiority grounded in spiritual universality and moral philosophy. As the Asian Relations Conference of 1947, political elites articulated a shared narrative positioning Asia as the historical origin of ethical and religious traditions capable of correcting the moral deficiencies of European modernity. This rhetorical maneuver didn't dismantle the hierarchical logic of civilization, it had merely altered the ranking criteria. European technological progress was reframed as evidence of ethical decay, while Asian philosophical traditions were recast as indicators of higher civilizational maturity. The implications of this discourse strategy are structured significantly by framing political independence as a restoration of civilizational equilibrium rather than merely a transfer of sovereignty. Asian elites constructed a normative foundation for collective identity formation. This identity formation subsequently enabled the emergence of transnational coalitions capable of exerting influence disproportionate to their material capabilities. Gandhi's semiotic reversal and the weaponization of identity. Mohandas Gandhi's rhetoric used of the term coolie illustrates a deliberate strategy of linguistic subversion designed to neutralize the symbolic power of colonial classification systems. The repetition of a derogatory term within formal diplomatic discourse functioned as a mechanism of semantic erosion, reducing its capacity to sustain racial hierarchy. By appropriating the language of domination, Gandhi destabilized the conceptual architecture upon which imperial legitimacy depended. This approach reflects an early form of discursive realism. Rather than rejecting the conceptual vocabulary imposed by colonial actors, post-colonial leaders manipulated it to generate alternative political meanings. This strategy demonstrates recognition that power operates not only through military and economic resources, but also through symbolic systems that structure perceptions of legitimacy. The transformation of racialized language into an instrument of political mobilization reflects an implicit understanding of psychological warfare within international politics. Identity categories, when redefined, alter the perceived distribution of moral authority. Once moral authority shifts, diplomatic leverage follows. Bandung and the emergence of collective strategy ambiguity. The Bandung Conference represents a transitional phase in the evolution of post-colonial geopolitical coordination. Delegations displayed divergent interpretations of sovereignty, reflecting conflicting models of international order. Some actors conceptualized sovereignty as absolute autonomy, while others emphasized independence and interdependence as an unavoidable structural condition of modern international relations. Jawaharlal Nehru's conception of interdependence demonstrates an early articulation of systematic thinking. The global order was understood as a network of reciprocal effects rather than a set of isolated national trajectories. This implication is straightforward. Regional instability cannot be contained within geographical boundaries because alliance systems transmit conflict across political space. Within this framework, non-alignment functioned as a friction reducing mechanism analogous to a buffer zone in classical mechanics. By remaining outside formal alliance structures, non-aligned states reduce the probability of escalation between superpower blocs. The absence of total alignment created zones of diplomatic maneuverability in which negotiations could occur without immediate military consequences. This logic undermines moral interpretations of non-alignment. The policy was not merely an expression of peaceful intent, it was a structural intervention designed to alter the interaction dynamics of competing hegemonic systems. Race, civilization, and the persistence of hierarchical thinking. Despite attempts to reverse European civilizational hierarchies, post-colonial discourse often reproduce exclusionary logic when addressing internal divisions. Discussions of backward populations within Asian societies reveal the persistence of hierarchical classification frameworks. The language of developmental lag and cultural isolation indicates that civilizational discourse continued to function as a technology of differentiation even after the collapse of formal colonial rule. The continuation of hierarchical categorization demonstrates that the rejection of European domination did not eliminate the epistemological structure that enabled domination. Instead, authority over classificatory systems shifted from imperial actors to post-colonial elites. The result was the internalization of civilizational stratification as a domestic governance tool. This phenomenon illustrates a recurring pattern in political transformation processes. Institutional logic persists even when personal change. Power is rarely dismantled, it is redistributed. Non-alignment as geopolitical risk management. Cold War bipolarity imposed structural constraint on medium power states, whose survival depended on avoiding entanglement in superpower conflict escalation pathways. Non-alignment functioned as a risk diversification strategy. By refueling permanent alliances commitments, states perceived the ability to extract concessions from competing blocs. The formation of NAM increased collective bargaining capacity by aggregating diplomatic weight, while individual states lacked the economic or military capacity to influence superpower decision making. Coordinated action created the appearance of systematic legitimacy. This legitimacy translated into negotiating leverage in forums addressing nuclear disarmaments, trade arrangements, and developmental financing. The rational choice interpretation of non-alignment emphasizes utility maximization under conditions of constrained agency. Ideological narrative served as a signaling mechanism designed to conceal strategic calculations behind moral language. The gap between rhetoric and behavior is not evidence of hypocrisy but confirmation of instrumental rationality. The myth of moral exceptionalism in Indian foreign policy. The portrayal of Indian foreign policy as uniquely principled obscures empirical inconsistencies, including the gradual strengthening of relations within the Soviet Union during the 1960s. Such behavior indicates that strategic necessity frequently overrode normative commitments. Moral narratives persisted because they performed reputational functions. A state perceived as principled gains credibility when mediating disputes, thereby increasing diplomatic relevance. Reputation becomes a soft form of soft power. Reputation becomes a form of soft power, convertible into influence across multilateral institutions. The persistence of moral rhetoric therefore reflects strategic communications rather than ideological rigidity. The distinction between moral identity and strategic behavior is essential for accurate interpretation of post-colonial foreign policy trajectories. Interdependence and the structural logic of buffer zones. The geopolitical theory underlying non-alignment draws implicitly upon models of friction in physical systems. When opposing forces interact directly, the probability of collision increases. Introducing an intermediary reduces kinetic transfer, thereby lowering the probability of catastrophic outcomes. Non-aligned states occupy these intermediary positions. Their existence complicated binary categorization, forcing superpowers to engage in indirect competition mediated through diplomatic rather than purely military channels. The buffer function created opportunities for negotiation frameworks that might otherwise have been structurally impossible. This interpretation reframes non-alignment as systematic engineering rather than ideological deviation. The objective was not neutrality but influence over parameters within which conflict occurred. The strategic utility of civilizational narratives in coalition formation. Coalition formation requires shared identity constructions capable of transcending national differences. Civilizational discourses provide such a construct by positioning a common historical experience, subordination, and a shared intellectual heritage distinct from European modernity. By framing political solidarity as a continuation of civilizational revival, leaders transform cooperation into an existential imperative rather than a transactional calculation. This framing reduced coordination costs by aligning ideological expectations across diverse political systems. However, this reliance on civilizational narratives introduced internal contradictions. Assertions of universal moral superiority conflicted with the persistence of internal hierarchies and regional rivalries. This resulting tension required continuous rhetorical adjustments to maintain coalition cohesion. Structural consequences of non-alignment for the international system. The existence of NAM altered the distribution of diplomatic agency within international institutions such as the United Nations. Voting blocs composed of newly independent states influenced agenda formation, particularly in debates concerning decolonization, economic redistribution, and nuclear non-proliferation. Although non-aligned states lacked coercive power, their collective legitimacy created normative pressure on superpowers to justify policy decisions. In universalist terms, the requirement to maintain ideological credibility constrained over displays of dominance. Normative constraints represent a form of indirect power. Even dominant actors must operate within legitimacy boundaries to sustain alliance networks and domestic political support. Conclusions. Non-alignment as controlled autonomy. Non-alignment was neither an ethical anomaly nor an ideological accident. It was a calculated response to systematic asymmetry designed to preserve decision autonomy under conditions of structural constraint. Civilizational discourse functioned as ideological infrastructure enabling coalition formation, while strategic ambiguity maximized bargaining leverage. The persistence of hierarchical thinking within postcolonial discourse demonstrates that power structures rarely disappear. They are repurposed. The non-aligned movement illustrates how actors lacking material dominance can reshape institutional environment by manipulating normative frameworks. In analytical terms, non-alignment represents a case study in strategic adaptation by medium power states operating within bipolar system. Its significance lies not in its moral claims but in its demonstration that agency can be expanded through institutional innovation even when structural conditions appear unfavorable.